Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
Looking to take your sports knowledge to the next level? Just a fan of wrestling and entertainment? You're in the right place. Welcome to The Show with your hosts, Hollywood JDT and Stuntman Kirk.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new episode of The Show. We have a special guest with us. Some of you know him as the iconic voice of the Power Rangers, Zordon, Mr. David Fielding. How you doing, sir?
Good. How are you? Glad to be here.
Doing good. Well, thank you for taking this time with us. And first and foremost, how have you guys, how have you been doing? I hope you're staying safe with the way the world is right now and everything with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the pandemic has really sort of altered a lot of the ways that we do things nowadays. And luckily, I've been fairly lucky as far as not having to deal with it really that much. I mean, I'm healthy. I'm following all the safety protocols, and my family's all healthy, and they're following all the safety protocols. So we're all good. But we just have to take things day by day and see how things go. So,
I was watching. I can't remember now whose live stream it was. And it was funny, but also like kind of cool to see how many Power Ranger fans were out there and how many like the running gag was like, how could the Power Rangers fix this? And getting into that series with it, how did it come to be you being the voice of Zordon and being that iconic voice for that series that so many people have grown up with?
I went to college in San Marcos, Texas for my undergraduate degree in acting, and I made a lot of friends there. And when I went to the University of Pittsburgh on the East Coast to do my Master of Fine Arts, a lot of the friends that I had made in Texas had moved out to California. So when I joined them 3 years later, after I'd finished the master's program, one of those friends, Stacy Fish, was actually working at Saban. She had been doing like production work on some of the movies that they were doing that were going straight to video at the time. And she was actually working, I think, as second AD on the pilot they were shooting at that time, which was called Dino Rangers. And she called me up. I'd only been in LA for like 2 months. And she called me up and said, "Hey, we're having auditions for this role. I think you'd be really good for it. Can you come down to the office this afternoon and audition?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. That's what I'm in LA for." And I went down there thinking that it would be a cattle call, that it would be like, 15,000 other guys. I'd read lines, go home and never hear anything again. But when I got down there, it was just me and another gentleman, and they told us they were going to cast it that day and shoot it the next week, and were we available for these dates and these times and blah blah blah. And he went into the room first and he did his little audition, and he was in there for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And then they brought me in and they introduced me to the original cast. They introduced me to the directors, the producers, and then they had me stand up on a table and audition. And the voice I auditioned with was the voice that we ended up filming. It's my face as the character too.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. And then we shot it the next week. And at that time, it hadn't been picked up. It hadn't been sold to Fox. Fox was looking at it, but they hadn't actually signed all the paperwork and crossed the T's and dotted the I's and that sort of thing. So when we got through filming, they said, well, we'll call you, when the show gets picked up. And I was like, yeah, sure. Okay. You do that. Because that's the standard thing. There's so many pilots that get shot and so many things that don't get beyond that stage, that it's just sort of normal for you to, shoot a pilot and then go on your way and do other things. But I did get a call like 3 weeks later saying, congratulations, the show's been picked up. And I was like, fantastic. When do I report to set? And they're like, oh, well, we're not going to film you anymore. We're just going to bring you in. So, I mean, it was exciting, but it was also a little bittersweet to, be a part of this show. And as prominent as the character was, I was never on set with the guys after that. it was almost 20 years later that I got to meet them again. So it was very strange.
Wow. And I put out on some of the Power Ranger Facebook message boards for people if they had any questions, and that was one of the questions people had was like, who was your favorite actor to work with that? But that obviously would have been a much,
Yeah, I mean the
part at that point, I guess.
well, I mean, I didn't really get to interact with the cast that much, other than that initial audition, and then the day we shot, they were all there feeding me lines for the scenes that we shot. But I didn't really get to know any of them. Didn't really get to interact with them. I interacted with Richard Horvitz and Barbara Goodson a lot when we were recording voices. Barbara was, of course, Rita Repulsa, and Richard was Alpha 5. So there were a number of times when we were at the recording studio at the same time. So I got to meet them and get to know them a little bit better. But again, when you're recording these voices for these shows, it's generally a very solitary thing. You're in the booth by yourself, looking at the screen, looking at the timer bar, and making sure that you can squeeze your words in the space that needs to be set so they could, plug them into the shot or whatever. And it was just very interesting to see how the show was put together from behind the scenes. And I got to know some of the audio engineers, and I was really good friends with Tony Oliver at the time, and had aspirations to be a writer then, and had submitted script ideas and scripts for the show. And had I stayed in LA, had I continued to work on the show, I might have gone in that direction. I might have written some episodes for the show or whatever. They made it pretty clear from early on that Zordon was basically a very static character. They had no plans to bring him outside of the tube or to explore anything like that. So I don't know if things would have been different had I stayed out there or not, but that's a sort of what if situation. Who knows what would have gone on.
Right. How getting into the writing, and you've talked about when we were just before we started recording that you've done a number of writing projects and that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like how did that ultimately come to be, and what have you worked on, and what writing is there out there?
Sure. I grew up reading very early. I started reading when I was 3 and 4 and loved books and stories. And when I was in high school, I got involved in D&D and role-playing games, and was able to tell stories that way, and was always fooling around with the idea of writing a short story or writing a novel. And it was always in the back of my head that that's sort of what I wanted to do. But I was exploring other things, growing up through my late teens, early adulthood, all the way up until about the age of 40. When I left LA, I moved back to the East Coast and got involved in video games, the video game industry. I was doing voices for video games, voices for radio and TV commercials, and eventually moved outside of Boston and went to work for a video game company called Impressions Games. They did a bunch of city builder games, Caesar 3, Zeus, Poseidon, basically games where a player would create a city, and then they would have goals to accomplish, or they would have to defeat armies that were threatening to sack their city or whatever. And I did voices for that, and did QA for video games for a long time. And then I moved on to a different company called Stainless Steel and worked for them for a while. And then I got hired by Mad Dog Software to do the sequel for a game called Empire Earth. Empire Earth was a real-time strategy game that I did like 98% of the voices for that game, all the unit death sounds, all the quest dialogue and sort of stuff like that. So when I was hired as a designer for the sequel, I got to stretch my writing muscles and write quest dialogue and story and hint book descriptions and stuff like that. And then really started to examine some of the stories that I had created earlier in my life, and just really started to get more serious about actually finishing some of that stuff. And then about 2010, 2011, I started submitting short stories and stuff to independent magazines and stuff because before the internet, you basically had to like print out your book and send it off to a publisher for them to read in order to get noticed. But because of the internet, because of digital files, that really changed the whole face of what publishing is all about. And instead of spending so much money and killing so many trees to print out a 400-page book with typing paper or whatever, you would just be able to send like a Word document to somebody and they would be able to read it. So through the magic of the internet and Facebook groups, I found a number of independent publishers that were looking for stories and was able to submit, and was lucky enough to get published. And then I started to really work on full-length novels. I self-published a superhero novel, and last year I was tapped by Caffeine and Ink to do my paranormal series, the Lincoln Bride series. That's what I'm doing now.
And where can the listeners kind of be able to find those books at, and be able to kind of keep up on that newest work?
Yeah, I've posted the link to where they can buy the book on my social media, on Instagram account, my Twitter account, and my Facebook Zordon page. I post about Lincoln Bride quite a bit, so they can find some of those posts on any of my social media sites.
Awesome. Where you mentioned, I want to backtrack over to follow up on there. You had mentioned that it had been like 20 years before you got to meet the whole cast. When was that time frame, or when was that event? I mean,
I sort of like forgot about the show once I left, and it was just sort of like a really neat anecdote that I could tell people at parties. Oh yeah, I was on a TV show in the early '90s, and it wasn't until Facebook that I started getting messages from people asking me if I was this guy who played Zordon or whatever. And in 2011, I was contacted by the man who ran Tekka Shokan, which is an anime convention that happens in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was living at the time. And that was my first time going to a convention and sitting on stage in front of a bunch of Power Rangers fans, and sort of realizing, wow, this thing is big and it's still going on. And I had to do a lot of homework. I had to do a lot of catching up. And then in 2014, I was contacted by Scott Zillner, who runs Power Morphicon, which is the biggest Power Rangers convention in the world. Happens every 2 years. And he invited me out to Power Morphicon, and I was like, well, I'd love to. I just can't afford to fly out there and put myself up. And he goes, oh no, we'll take care of all that. And that was sort of my introduction to conventions. And that was also the first time that I got to meet Austin St. John, David Yost, and Walter Jones again. And what was great is that they immediately recognized me. They knew who I was. They remembered me, and that was really great. We met once 25 years ago, and they remembered who I was. So that was very cool. And then since that convention, it just sort of snowballed for me, doing a convention a month for the last 5 years or whatever. And I get to see them on a very regular basis, and we've had dinners together. We've talked about a bunch of stuff. So they're much more friends today than we were way back in the day.
If there was the newest movie that came out a couple years back. Mm-hmm. Did you have a chance to be able to see that?
Oh yeah, I saw that in the theater, and it was really awesome. It was also very strange to be sitting in the audience and hear the name Zordon, and nobody would be looking at me. So it was very interesting. But I thought casting Bryan Cranston was a brilliant move. He did such a great job. I was a little bit jealous because the motion capture technology today is so much better than the technology we were using in '92, and the way that Zordon's face was able to move around and be much more expressive than just sort of the static image that we had for the character because because they recycled all the footage that we shot for the pilot over and over, it just got to the point where they couldn't do the same motions over and over. So the later you get into the series, you see that Zordon he's just kind of planted there. He doesn't move at all. His mouth doesn't move. He's very sort of frozen in time. And I thought that the dynamic motion of Zordon and his expressiveness was something that really could have helped the TV series, but they were limited by the technology. So,
and I guess kind of looking at that today with the way, and I'm going to go into the second fan question we got with that, being back in Zordon's role, if you had to look at this came from Natalie Laban, if you looked at today's young actresses and actors, who would you recruit into the Power Ranger group?
Wow.
They went big with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I always sort of, you always have to look at Power Rangers in the context of the time that it was done, and from a storyteller's point of view, from a writer's point of view, it was always sort of silly to me that here's this 10,000-year-old wizard who's trapped in a time warp, who's been on the planet Earth for 10,000 years, has but at the moment of this big crisis where Rita reemerges or whatever, he chooses the 5 kids from Angel Grove. He doesn't choose them from around the world. He doesn't choose them from different locations. They're all from one little juice bar in the middle of Angel Grove. That's where he grabbed them from. And I thought it was great. I mean, Power Rangers was really sort of ahead of the curve as far as diversity in casting. They had Hui Trang, and in the original pilot, they had Audrey Dubois, who played Trini, who was Latina. And then we had Thuy Trang, who was Asian. And we have Walter Jones, who is Black. And so, they were really sort of ahead of the curve as far as like introducing diversity, because, and I think that's one of the reasons why the show was so popular, is that it could be anybody under those colors and those masks. Anybody could be a Power Ranger. And so if I had my choice to choose from today, who would I make Power Rangers today? I really don't know. I'd have to sit down and actually go through the list of who's upcoming and who's popular. I thought I did a great job of casting for the 2017 movie with Dacre Montgomery and Becky G and Naomi and all the guys, Ludi Lin, all the cast that they did for 2017. I thought that they tapped into some really good actors there. So I would have to sit down and actually go through like a list of who, that would be fun or whatever. And then, so my short answer is I really don't. I'd have to like go through a whole list or whatever. But hopefully they, it would be from all over. It wouldn't be just from like one central location.
I think that's a really good answer. And you had mentioned that it's the way that the show has kind of developed, and when you went to that Comic-Con, not really realizing how big Power Rangers was.
Yeah,
I had that same kind of thing of like watching it when it first came on, growing up with it, and then kind of went away from it when the original kind of show really kind of started wrapping up, and before it became into some of the, I guess the way they label it out, it's all the same series, but the kind of the spin-off parts of that,
right?
And wasn't until it was on Netflix and my son was watching, and I put it on, and it's like, hey, you should watch this, and like he fell in love with the show, and then starting to look out there like what some Power Ranger toys and stuff for him, and realizing how big the world had become, even more than it was at that point.
Yeah, it's huge.
I think it's been cool to kind of see that original show growing up, that most people know who the Power Rangers are, but that connection to it being something that it is today is been kind of really cool to see how much of a pulp culture phenomenon and just history making kind of show that became.
Yeah, I mean, they really had lightning in a bottle with that thing. I mean, it was the right show at the right time. Um, uh, Jurassic Park came out like 2 months before the show debuted, and dinosaurs were huge. So the show had a real dinosaur theme, and kids love dinosaurs, and so they picked up on that. And um, it was big giant rubber monsters and big giant robots, and kids flying around and kicking gray putties in the face, and uh, it was just everything that a 6, 7, and 8-year-old kid dreams about. It was action. It had rock and roll. They had all of the elements there, and right away, right immediately, they had toys in the store when the show popped open, and it just exploded. So it was awesome.
If there was one out of all the episodes you did with it, if there's one episode that you can remember kind of being your favorite at that, or set of lines, what would that one be?
It's gonna sound really cheesy because the first episode, the pilot episode, is always my favorite. Not because that was the only one that I filmed, because of what Zordon says, and also my favorite moment from the pilot is that Zordon brings the kids to the command center, and he tells them about what's going on. He tells them that if they choose to be, they can rise up and become the heroes and take Rita down. And that's the first episode that he calls them Power Rangers. He tells them about the morphers and what will happen to them, and talks about what their abilities are and why they are chosen for this role. And what I really like about it is that the guys reject him at first. They say, "Nah, thanks. I don't want to do this." And then when they're leaving, they get attacked by the putties, and they realize, oh, this thing is really serious. And so they take Zordon's offer, and they become the Power Rangers, and they defeat the putties, and then they go on to defeat the original threat. So I thought that was a really great take on the hero cycle that everybody knows and learns about in school these days, about how the hero is offered something and then they rejected it first, and then they come back and they take it up and they become the hero. And they really captured that. And so that's always my first episode, because it's a little deeper than people just think about guys jumping around in spandex and kicking robots in the face and stuff. But that's always my favorite, because I call them Power Rangers for the first time, so that's cool.
I don't know how to encap that any better. I think that's truly is kind of that setup with the way it built up was the perfect way to kind of kick off, and it truly gives that real life almost to it. I mean, if you put real teenagers in that spot, they would be like, yeah, you're crazy, and like, yeah, whatever, dude. Like, and then not till you're presented with something that you're like, oh, this might be more serious than I thought.
Yeah.
I see that with my 12-year-old stepson at this point, even at times. So with just normal things. So so where can people, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know you got a busy day on you. Where can people follow you at on the social medias, and be able to kind of keep up with any new projects that are coming along?
Sure. On Instagram, you can find me at djfielding_Zordon. You can find me on Twitter at David J. Fielding. And if you search Facebook for Zordon, my Zordon page should be the first thing that pops up. That's where that's all three of the social media platforms that I post on. And I'm always posting on upcoming conventions or upcoming appearances or updates about stuff that I'm writing or working on. So that's where people can find me.
Well, sir, thank you so much for taking this time with us. I truly appreciate it. This was, truly I can't even really put it into words other than just a really cool moment to be able to talk with you. And
sure, not a problem.
Thank you for doing this, and hopefully when some unnamed projects that are out there, hopefully if those can come to light as things get back to somewhat of a normal,
Yeah.
we can have you on again and be able to talk some more.
Sounds good. Sounds perfect.
Thank you so much, sir.
Alrighty. Have a great one.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Show with Hollywood JDT and Stuntman Kirk. Want to stay in the know on all things sports, wrestling, movies, and TV? Follow the show on social media at The Show Podcast. If you like today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on The Show.